Welcome everyone to the Tech Talk on accelerating work and innovation. It's my great honor to kick us off today. We have a really exciting panel for you today. And I just want to say this is hosted by the Psychology of Technology Institute. For those of you who haven't checked us out yet, you can go to psychoftech.org. Our mission is to upgrade science so that we can better understand the human technology relationship and also to amplify the science. And so we've been having these tech talks in pursuit of that goal. And we're really excited for this one today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm one of the co-directors of the Psych of Tech Institute, Juliana Schroeder, and then Nate Fast is the other co-director, and he's going to introduce the moderators, and we're going to get going.
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm Nate Fast, the other co-director, and just want to welcome all of you here and also our wonderful panelists and moderators for today's talk. And so we're just going to hand it over to the moderators who will take it and run with it. Thank you so much to both of you for organizing. So one of our moderators was Hila Lifshitz-Assaf over at NYU, and Sarah Lebovitz, who is over at the University of Virginia McIntyre School. Thank you so much to both of you for putting this together. And in the interest of time, we'll just send it all over to you. So.
Thank you, Nate and Juliana. We're excited about this. So I'm Hila from NYU.
I am Sarah Lebovitz. I am at UVA.
And we wanted to start this by sharing with you a little bit about how we got to explore this fascinating topic of accelerating innovation and work. So for me, it started with my longitudinal field study of new innovation processes at NASA. For 1 year, I was studying how NASA scientists and engineers experimenting with opening their strategic projects, hard R&D challenges that they've been working on for several years, to crowdsourcing and open innovation online platforms for anyone to solve. And the surprise was that a scientific breakthrough was achieved in 3 months by a solver online to one of these hard, long working R&D problems. So I then tracked in the paper that you can see how the scientists and engineers responded to these surprising results, and changing the innovation processes required a deep transformation in their identity, and that takes time. But I constantly kept on wondering, wait a minute, this breakthrough happened in 3 months. Maybe R&D challenges and processes as we know it should not take as long as they usually do. I mean, maybe we should start questioning the time that innovation takes and which parts of innovation take longer and why. So this led me to the next study with Sarah Lebovitz and Edmondson, focusing only on accelerated innovation processes, specifically hackathons and makeathons, 3 days where various professionals come together to innovate on a specific problem. In our case, assistive technologies. So they had a very highly ambitious goal of building a new working assistive technology product to hand over to a needed user in the end of 72 hours. So a very challenging task. And we know that creativity often gets killed under the gun, and the team coordination is very hard. So we were curious to see, how does that actually work? How can some of these products, some of these teams really develop so fast new products? So we found that accelerating innovation is indeed tricky, and it creates this temporal ambiguity. How should we go about this new task in this kind of crazy new condensed time frame? And that a common mistake that we want to warn people from is to try to take the regular best innovation processes and compress them to the accelerated time frame. The teams that try to do it, and we saw this again and again, failed. So the teams that succeeded actually coordinated in a very different way, almost the opposite of what we teach usually about coordination, and we call it minimal and adaptive coordination. And that enabled them to embrace this temporal ambiguity and these new conditions around time. And I'll move it to Sarah to share how that took us forward around time and technology.
Right. So we saw the importance of these findings even more powerfully over the past year with the rise of COVID, as the world was struggling to accelerate work processes and find fast, innovative solutions to really massive challenges. And we saw the attempts and failures of different organizations and managers and employees who were trying and are still trying to compress that traditional work process and speed it up to respond to these needs, rather than to rethink and reimagine what the innovation process could look like. So we build on in our study and hope to draw in some literature from the temporality field of study. We are specifically interested in building these connections between temporality and technology. And in the hackathon case, the exciting technologies that were used to accelerate the process were 3D printers and Arduino, Raspberry Pi, and we're seeing many types of technologies that are changing and accelerating work and organizational processes. In a separate study, I'm studying with Hila the use of AI in radiology, which has a lot of themes around the pace of work and drives for efficiency and the impact on the employees and the outputs of their work. So we think these exciting relationships are really worth spending some time teasing apart and setting up a future program of study. And so we've brought together these 3 excellent experts, and we're hoping to have a really rich discussion around the accelerating processes, innovation, work, and technologies, and what needs to be studied next. So we will turn it over to our first panelist to introduce themselves and to give a quick few minutes on what we know. And we'll start with Amy Edmondson.
Oh, great. I was sort of hoping you wouldn't start with me, because, but it's okay. Don't worry. I can do it.
I was going alphabetically, so we'll.
Yeah, I guess I should have recognized that. The more I hear, the richer my response. I'm a social psychologist, micro-organizational behaviorist, I guess, by training, and so I have no right to be here. I'm not a technology expert. I think I've become more of an innovation expert along the way over the years. But fundamentally, I mean, I love this topic, and I think I have permission to bring something to it that matters. And the headlines of what matters are psychological safety and teaming. Psychological safety, which I'll define as a belief that one can be candid at work, that one can share without worry that others will humiliate or reject you in some way, your tentative ideas, your questions, your concerns, your critiques, your wacky ideas as well. And that's psychological safety. It's not about being nice. It's not about everything goes, anything goes. It's not the same as job security, but it's really a sense of felt permission for candor. So this, to me, this is a topic I've been working on for 20 years, but it seems to me increasingly relevant as the pace of work speeds up, as the demand for innovation speaks up. So in other words, what we have found is that naturally people will err on the side of holding back. They will err on the side of not taking interpersonal risks. Being quiet never hurt anybody, right? Whereas there is a deep belief and sometimes experience that speaking up when you're not quite sure that you know what you're talking about could be costly. So full stop, people will lots and lots of data on this. People err on the side of holding back. And that could be absolutely devastating for the consequences of any kind of fast moving work. Now, I will say that Google did a huge service to this work, because I had certainly been toiling away in academia with different studies showing positive effects of psychological safety in contexts ranging from healthcare delivery to consumer products to banking to NASA even. And yet Google came along and did their famous Project Aristotle study with the express purpose to answer the research question, what explains persistent performance differences across teams at Google? And their answer, succinctly put, was psychological safety. Not something they expected, not something they were looking for, but something that got widely publicized with the help of New York Times Magazine and reporter Charles Duhigg in a very long and thoughtful article. That put psychological safety on the map, not just in the tech world, but elsewhere. And so I think it's perfect that it was a Google, right? Because that is a context where innovation matters, where speed matters, where things do seem to be speeding up. So they help us, they help me anyway, make an even more credible case that this matters more than ever, given the context that Sarah and Hila described. Number two, and less long, is teaming. More and more, with the pace of innovation, the speed of work, the nature of the work requires us to collaborate, to coordinate, to team up. And yet we're not teaming up in the old-fashioned way. We're not in, quite often the work just won't allow us to be in sort of stable, familiar teams where we know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and can do this kind of collaboration almost effortlessly. Instead, what we find is more and more teamwork on the fly, coordinating and collaborating with different people across boundaries of all kinds at different times without a clear line of sight in how it's all going to come together. So I've spent lots of time, as I said, studying both of those things, both psychological safety as an attribute for effectiveness in complex work, and teaming as a kind of, it's not a choice, it's just a reality that we have to learn how to do better.
I just want to segue before we move to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Amy. This was fascinating. And I have to say something about Amy's modesty, which I was so surprised by. When I first told her this subject, she also said, how is my work relevant? I was like, what do you even mean? I was like, of course it's relevant. And I've seen it in the field, the teaming and, you know, having all these ad hoc teams and everything that Amy has been written about is one of the key ways that organizations are using to speed things up. And when they are under pressure, that's one of the things that you're using. And I'm really honored to hear that the psychological safety was actually found. I didn't know about it to be one of those key things. So I think both of these streams of work are really important. And the connection between teaming and Michael's work is actually really interesting, I think. So I'll let you, Michael, present your work on new ways of organizing and the rest of your amazing work. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Hila.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm a computer scientist, and that means that I'm interested in not necessarily what is, although I base a ton of my work on an understanding of what is, and much more on what could be better. How could we better improve our collaborations through design, through technology? How can they act as amplifiers rather than as choke points? And in particular, the thing that really motivates me is to think about how we can empower ourselves to achieve what would be our most ambitious collective goals. How do we work together to create the next wonder of the world? You know, could computation help us amplify our collective achievements? I think there's a lot of evidence that it's sort of going the other direction right now. Could we turn that around? And the reason why I think this is possible is that from everything from small teams to massive crowds, people have to work together to solve these kinds of problems. And every single one of these groups has so many different ways that it could organize itself, how they're going to coordinate, how they're going to socialize, how they're going to make decisions, and much, much more. So just in this group of panelists and attendees at the webinar, we probably have as many different opinions on this question as we have people in the room. And we know from the behavioral sciences that choosing that right design is really, really critical. Because if we make the wrong decision, it leads to fraud interactions at best, outright dissolution at worst. And there's just a ton of research that demonstrates we're really, really poor at making those decisions, that it's a hard problem. Just like our cognition is really, can give rise to biased decision-making at an individual level in the judgment decision-making literature. The social sciences and organizational behavior research are showing that even experts can exhibit really poor decision-making about how we design these macro scale structures that influence our interpersonal interactions. So I guess if I were to summarize it, my take is that increasingly when we fail to achieve those collective goals, it's less and less because we don't have the skills to achieve it, and more because we have these fraught collaborations that are holding us back. And you might ask, why is a computer scientist on this panel? Why am I here? And I think this is where I see the big lever moving forward, because groups are increasingly interacting online through computational mediation, right? Through collaboration tools, crowdsourcing marketplaces, social network sites, essentially saying that just like an architect could design a physical space to influence positive behaviors, we as designers and computer scientists have the responsibility to say, well, how are we going to architect this online collaboration space? So there are a ton of decisions that are made in Zoom, just as this one example, that have a ton of influences on how we behave, and it can be done poorly or well. And I think developing these systems opens up all sorts of fundamental questions that are social scientific in nature and design and engineering opportunities. I'll take just one example, taking inspiration from Amy's good use of one example. So you might wonder, like, what's the best way for teaming to work? Should we be flat, hierarchical? Should we be encouraging, critical? There's a lot of work that's theorizing ideal structures, but it's such a complicated space that it really depends on the people and the task. It's contingent. So even trained professionals are often getting it wrong. And again, that's not because we're not smart. It's just a really, really hard decision space to navigate. And so together with my my collaborator and faculty colleague, Melissa Valentine at Stanford, we started wondering whether we could empower teams to experiment on themselves to see what works well, to create a sort of an adaptive AI that would help you guide your team toward the right set of structures to help you collaborate. So this is a system that takes feedback as you're going from team members or from performance, and suggest potential changes to your hierarchy, to your norms of engagement, to your decision-making norms, feedback norms, anything you might want to you think might be important. So as you're giving feedback, like how well you're enjoying it, how the team is doing, the system's suggesting tweaks, like, maybe we should all be more blatantly positive in our feedback. Or maybe we should be trying to have a more decentralized or a more hierarchical decision-making structure, just trying little nudges and seeing what works. Now, there are tons of technically interesting questions here, because if you just throw the state-of-the-art algorithms at this, it's going to suggest 15 different changes at once. And it's sort of like when I, as a PhD mentor, tell my students like 15 different things, and they just sort of zone out and nothing happens. But if you apply a little bit of, I guess what I would call human-centered algorithm design to this, you can start to account for it. You can make sure you're only suggesting as many changes as the team can absorb. You're not suggesting certain kinds of changes too early in the team cycle or too late in the team cycle. And some early field experiments we've done suggest that these teams exhibit something on the range of 40% in performance improvement compared to self-managing teams, manager-led teams, teams with previous state-of-the-art algorithms. Again, really early results. I don't expect that size of an effect would really hold up in long-term field deployments, but there's some really, really encouraging early signs that we can do this. And the reason is that people underexplore. We're risk averse, right? We try a few things, we say, oh, okay, that's good enough, let's work this way. And then the algorithms are over exploring, but by sort of combining, you can find a little bit of the Goldilocks in the principle, in the middle, finding something that helps, that legitimately might help. And we can ask tons of other questions, which I won't get into. Questions like, can we help ourselves get off on the right foot? Could we help rotate our interactions so that we find the right collaborators at the right time, and so on? Just many opportunities. But just to close, like, we have to balance all this against the potential negative outcomes if we do this wrong. So we have to proceed really carefully, and we can talk a lot more about that.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is fascinating. And I hope you can see the connection between this ad hoc teaming that Amy has beautifully written about, and you taking a computational science perspective and saying, okay, let's architect the whole thing and think about, based on everything that we know from the research that behavioral scientists have done, how can we actually provide people with new ways of organizing? And maybe it could be faster, but definitely it could be better. And you're showing it already in your work. So I thank you for that. And it's fascinating. And then Melissa, we look forward to hearing about your work.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa. I wish we could see all your faces in person. It would probably be more engaging, but we're thrilled that you're here to listen to us and look forward to answering your questions. I'll be brief. It was interesting that both Amy and Michael kind of situated themselves of where they are academically. I would call myself a sociologist, but someone who really looks at microdynamics. And I've always done what we call kind of very qualitative or ethnographic work, which means almost the polar opposite of Michael, though we could work together well, where I look at kind of the day-to-day practices really closely. If I were to study you, I would just try and be as lovely and unobtrusive as possible, but I'd hang out in your office. I'd follow you to meetings. I would interview you. I spend, lots of hours within an organization, really trying to understand a lot of those microdynamics. And what that perspective allows me to see, when I've always looked at communication practices with regards to new and emerging technologies, because clearly these are very intertwined. And what it allows me to see is not just kind of, as Michael said, the dysfunctions that we have in our current organizing practices and the things that can like get in the way of psychological safety, right? Because it's more often not there than it is, which is why Amy's insight is so important. But what I'm able to look at is the way that these kind of really kind of subtle dynamics evolve between, you know, what we're trying to get done here today, our core values of like what matters, what doesn't matter, what kind of person is rewarded in this environment. So of course, if you can like figure that out, you're going to act like that person. And then maybe all of us are going to end up acting like that person. And that's going to have really interesting dynamics for how we communicate. Some of the kind of implicit power dynamics. One of the things that have always interested me is the way that time, since this is about time, this panel, how the way that we use time, meaning like how quickly you get back to someone, whether or not you were late for a meeting, whether or not, you know, you put in the extra hours, that those are all actual, you know, kind of uses of your time, but they also signal quite a lot of important information to those around you. And depending on the kind of cultural context of an organization or a team, they could either signal that you're really dedicated and someone that's really like valued here and that should get promoted and that should be like your peers should look up to you. Or they could signal that you're not very good at your work. Why do you have to stay late? Like you didn't get it done in the 4 hours that you were supposed to be here. Now, many of our organizations don't have that perspective, but we could see that that could be one that would exist, which would make that time use have a very different meaning to those of us, you know. So I look at those dynamics and oftentimes the introduction of new technologies, and this is where it gets into kind of the intersection between how we can get these toxic relationships at work and not perfect kind of organizing dynamics, because we tend to use these new tools in ways that uphold or further our norms and values. So if we are a culture that believes that the quicker you get back to someone, the more you care about them, the more dedicated you are, the better you are at your job, well, we're going to use tools that allow us to get back to each other quickly We aren't in a culture that says, oh, you know, you should take at least a day to get back to someone because then it shows that you've thought about your response. That's not our culture. So I look at the kind of, so I have two kind of insights about the ways that I feel that kind of information and communication technologies have shaped the current kind of state of organizing and the future. And one is this shift in expectation. So what does it mean to be good at your job? Many of us, I'm guessing many of you, live and work in organizations where an ideal worker is someone who really truly commits to the workplace. It's willing to work late, willing to, you know, pick up the phone at the last minute, willing to answer that text on Sunday morning or something. There's a very common, you know, experience and cultural experience in the United States in Western contexts. So technologies actually allow us to believe subtly that everybody's available all the time because I have that tool and so everybody else has that tool. And so why wouldn't somebody get back to me on Sunday night? Clearly they don't care about me or the job, right? So it allows that culture plus the technology creates this ramping up where we see this kind of 24/7 work mentality, this compression and acceleration of work dynamics that Hila and Sarah were talking about. And really these are kind of accidental. Nobody designed this in a Michael way. These are accidental dynamics that emerge because of the match between the properties of the technology and our values and norms. And the second thing I would say is I think there's a second effect of this, which is, I don't know about any of you, and this is not particularly true maybe as much during COVID, but remember when you went to work and for whatever reason you were asked to stay late. Now, for some of you, that was not a big deal. You just stayed late. But if you're someone who has a family or has a friend that's waiting for you to go out to dinner or, you know, tickets to a concert, that created a whole chain of events where you had to, you were like, your time was burdened by someone in the workplace. And that then turned around and you had to burden other people's time. So you had to text someone and say, hey, will you pick the kids up from daycare? Or, hey, I'm going to have to cancel on our, you know, our meeting up or whatever that is. So one of the other things technology does is it allows us to subtly and oftentimes invisibly to those around us immediately burden other people in order to manage, because there's this cascade of effort. When one person's time is burdened, you can see that temporal burden cascades out throughout their kind of web of support structures. And I think it's really interesting to think about how technology has both allowed us to do that easier, the quick text, while also, making it more invisible. So in summary, I'm interested kind of less in how to make it perfect, but really to unpack and kind of truly understand the complexity of the dynamics that make us get into these kind of traps socially and interpersonally that make it difficult to get into a place of psychological safety or efficient organizational design. So I got to go last and sum it all up.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating to see the connections and the different perspectives we bring to it, right? Like our different trainings, how we think about it. So now we have the option to talk a little bit about the connections between the work of the three of you, and also to talk about what we don't know. So let's explore a few areas that we think we don't know, and maybe people in the audience and other researchers would like to research that we think are interesting areas for future work. So one thing I wanted to ask you, based on the different presentations that you just gave, was on what do you think around, specifically around speed and acceleration that we felt now this year, let's say in COVID. Do you think you can see, for instance, on Amy's work, how can we develop psychological safety faster? It is not something easy. So it's almost a combination of teaming with psychological safety, right? Like if you just join a new team because of COVID and you have to, let's say, invent a new product or work really fast, like how can you develop it faster when it's also remote? It's much harder. It's not the same. And then on Michael, I wanted to ask, you said about collaborating better, but what about faster? Have you looked into it? Anything around it? And then Melissa, it sounds from what you're saying that you have an opinion about faster versus slower. Did you see negative implications? That's how it sounded from, but if you do, please share. And if you have anything, in general, and how you think maybe it's different now. And so these are, I would say, if we can focus across the different talks on specifically on speed, and specifically this year, what you would think would be interesting to understand in this situation that we're at, that would be really fascinating.
I want to hear from Amy first.
Putting Amy on the spot again.
Thanks, Michael. Just so much. I mean, what Hila just said and what all of you just said brings up about 10 things at once. But I almost don't know where to begin. But maybe I'll begin with a link. I mean, there's many links, I think, among the three of us, really among the five of us. But one link between me and Michael, which we probably seem like the two poles. Right. I'm a social psychologist. Of course, it may not be incidental that I had an undergraduate degree in engineering, but just saying, but our link could be playfully captured in two words, Melissa Valentine, but more conceptually captured by describing what that means. So Melissa
PhD student, and she's Michael's co-author. Just for
star at Stanford, my PhD student, and of whom I am proud, and which goes without saying. But Melissa and I studied emergency room teams who were, and maybe that gives me the opportunity to say a lot of what when you commented positively, Hila, on the teaming and and psychological safety, and that I'd sort of, done these two things that really do have such great relevance today. I need to give credit to healthcare, because I just happened to accidentally study healthcare delivery in hospitals years ago. And healthcare, the way people had to work in 24/7 healthcare delivery organizations was always a bellwether. Right? They were, if you went in there and, like Melissa, ethnographically studied what was going on ethnographically, you would see things that have since come to pass in the rest of our workplaces. So I went in initially to study teams, and it turned out I couldn't even define what is a team, right? Because the teams were fluid, were porous, were overlapping, were teaming, not teams. So that's where I got that insight from. And so Melissa and I studied, some bit later, we studied emergency room teams struggling with the immense pressures. This is a safety net hospital, the immense pressures of long wait times and challenging coordination, both medically challenging, but also interpersonally challenging with status differences. And this, they found this work really hard. So they did an experiment, which was creating something that we called team scaffolds, which weren't real teams, but they were more like real teams than normal life. So they intervened in a interpersonally and medically challenging setting to make it a bit less so by the introduction of just a little scaffolding that people could hang on to. For that paper, I'll give you the link, and it was in Org Science. But it relates to what Michael said, because he said, in a sense, if you ask human beings to just do better, it's not a great strategy, right? But if you sort of help them do better with some training wheels for the bicycle or some scaffolding that hold things in place loosely while you're developing those skills, then you've got a chance, at making that progress. So I think that's a big and important link. And I spend a lot of my time now, not always successfully, but a lot of my time trying to think about what the scaffolding might look like. For instance,
the conditions that
the question you asked about how do you speed up psychological safety, I've thought a lot about what must the scaffolding look like to just make permission for candor more explicit, more easy. And spent a lot of time during COVID trying to figure that out in a remote setting. I wrote a little piece on that too. So, so I think if you think about motivation and scaffolding, you have a promise.
Yes, please share anything around the remote environment, because I do think this is one of the challenges now to create the ability to both work fast, but to have good quality of work thanks to the psychological safety. And that's challenging to do in a remote environment. We've experienced it with online hackathons that we are mentoring constantly, and we're seeing a lot of failure around these issues. So that would be very helpful. Thank you, Amy. And Michael, to you. The computer science response.
Yeah, I guess I need to reply to Amy by saying, well, I was a cognitive science major, so we've got the engineer who became a social scientist. Yes,
we are all interdisciplinaries, not by chance. I think the fact that we all know each other and the fact that we all are able to talk about such a topic, it's because we're all interdisciplinaries.
Right, and I mean, I think we're using my colleague Melissa Valentine as an example, in part because it takes being able to walk around this from multiple sides, from a behavioral standpoint, say what's happening, what are the fundamentals here, and then to turn around and say, does it have to be that way? How could we rearrange the furniture? And Hila, your question about how do we make psychological safety faster is interesting. It almost feels kind of like ill-defined to me. Like, can we speed up the development of social capital?
Why do we want to even do it, you're saying?
Well, there are two kinds of ways you might accelerate, right? One is it's divergent. You do things a new way. You cut out some sort of vestigial approach that we thought we needed, but we no longer need. This is something that often we go for in my group's research. There's this very famous paper in my field called "Going Beyond Being There." The idea is always like, we should try to build a better Zoom, a better Skype, make it just like being there. And the argument of this paper, which is a classic in my field, basically says, stop that. That's dumb. You're never going to be as good as being there in the dimensions that being there is good. So you might as well try to be better, go beyond being there, do something you could never do in person. And I think that's really the missing ingredient. Like in my university environment, Stanford is brilliant in so many dimensions, and yet we still struggle because we're trying to sort of paste an old educational model onto a world in which, frankly, it looks a lot more like MOOCs. It's more transactional, the educational experiences. How do we set our goals differently rather than just trying to replicate? Just to give an example of accelerating psychological safety, or at least maybe something that might be an antecedent of psychological safety, my group, again, along with Melissa, started thinking about whether we could temporarily hide the transactional memory and attributions of a group. Could we let a team sort of meet for the first time repeatedly? So by messing with some online environments and some pseudonyms and so on, we can actually convene a team, have them work, make them think, then reconvene them again, but make them think they're working with a different team because they can't see each other, change the pseudonyms. Your name looks like it's always the same, but everyone else's looks like it's changing. So we can manipulation check this and it holds up. And we do this multiple times. And at the end, we sort of pull the curtain back and say, voila, here's the best team you worked with, the one you liked the best, the one with the highest team viability as measured by your surveys or whatever. Go forth and collaborate.
Oh my.
It turns out but you get multiple restarts. And even though it's the same people, you get variation naturally in how much people liked those initial, say 10 minutes of interaction. And that has impact downstream. So I think there are things we can do by sort of really breaking out of the mold. The only other thing I can think of when you're pushing me on accelerating, I think, Hila, you're probably thinking of some of the work that Melissa and I did with what we call flash teams, flash organizations, which is really about thinking about the connection to a networked labor market, right? What if you had an idea and could snap your fingers and have a team or an organization sort of appear around you within minutes working on that kind of thing? And this, I think, is not going to happen immediately, but if you look at platforms like Upwork and others, they're making work accessible through an API. And this has massive questions that need to be asked about sort of the social safety net. Mary Gray and many others are asking those questions, but it also has, it has some interesting questions about what's going to happen to how we collaborate. What happens if I say, oh man, I really need a Node.js developer. And rather than spending 3 weeks hiring someone, I put out a call and in 5 minutes, someone has joined my team and has been automatically onboarded, right? So there's things, that one's definitely not going to necessarily be great for psychological safety. We have to draw on these notions of team scaffolds and other that Amy was indicating, but it's definitely a different model. And we were, the teams in our experiments were, making short animated films in 48 hours and so on. Like there was some acceleration there. So certainly there are opportunities.
Definitely, I can tell you from some of the field kind of, I wouldn't even call it research, field exploration that I've been doing this year around organizations and new ways of organizing. I do see the work that you have done with Melissa Valentine around flash organizing taking place more because remote makes it easier since everyone is already online. Then when you bring someone from Upwork, it doesn't feel as much of a big shift. So this is something that I've heard talking from Deloitte that they're working on Pixel. I'm also teaching it now. There's a new HBS case actually written about it, and it's really fascinating to hear how they're changing. So they're doing it to themselves with consulting to be able to do really quick projects and things like you said, like on data science and things that they may not have the talent inside, but they're also consulting that to other organizations and building with them these new models of organizing to work in this much more teaming, flash way, but also with blurring boundaries between who's inside the organization, outside, who's working online, offline, from a network, from your organization. So I find it fascinating to see if we really will see some of these theories and models that we thought about a couple of years ago now taking place because of these new conditions. Thank you so much, Michael. Melissa, what do you think?
I was gonna say, so I have a couple things. I love going last. One of the things that came to me was the idea of accelerating psychological safety seems a little bit difficult to me because how do you accelerate something that often never happens in teams? It's a very rare thing to actually cultivate the kind of trust that Amy is talking about. And it's really, really special when it happens. So I think before asking how to accelerate it, I'm almost curious in this work from home, or at least virtual work, which is not new. I mean, we've been working virtually and there've been virtual teams for, at least the last 20 years. But more and more so. And the ways in which that we're going to engaging through these technological platforms, how do we even begin to create psychological safety in that dynamic, I think is just as important, but more of a question before we get to how to speed it up. And actually, I was part of a project with a different one of Amy's students. This is like Amy's Students Day, Michael Lee, where with Leslie Perlow, we looked at how the role, so this was a team that never saw each other, and they were across India and the United States and had serious, serious power and cultural problems by the time we came in to study them. Really no psychological safety, not a lot of trust, with half the team feeling like they really couldn't speak up at all. The other half of the team not thinking that the team that wasn't speaking up was lazy, and all kinds of horrible dynamics. And one of the things that we discovered, one of the key things that Amy said when she was first talking was the idea of social risk. It is risky to speak up. It is risky to disagree. It is risky to have an outside opinion when you're in a strongly normative, strongly hierarchical environment. That risk is even more experienced when you're on Zoom and you don't have someone subtly giving you the like, yeah, you can do it across the room eyebrow, or that friendly smile that opens up your willingness to take a social risk. And so one of the things that we discovered through this kind of intervention was that we provided this team scripts of interaction. And the scripts really said, like, these might be some stupid questions, but we want you to all go in a circle here on your Zoom screen and literally play. Like, some of them were games, like to actually get to know each of the games. And some of them were structured questions about how the work is proceeding and how to proceed to go forward. So the scripts were both about getting to know each other. My favorite was a very small Indian woman playing 2 truths and a lie, and said that she was 5'10", and nobody had ever seen her stand. So they had no idea that was a lie, right? So this shows some of the, like, really, you know, the paucity of how we're getting to know each other through these online spaces. But then there also were scripts about how are we getting the work done? How are you feeling about the work? And how is your stress level on like a scale of 1 to 5? Very basic. But what these scripts did is they simultaneously invited everyone to speak / force them to speak, right? So I have to give my stress level 1 to 5 rating. Now, whether or not I'm going to be honest about that depends on what everybody else, and whether or not we're able to create a dynamic of honesty. But just forcing / inviting everyone to speak was a really dramatic change, as well as, and if not more important than that, forcing everyone to listen. Right. So so these very basic scripts are just one of any number of kind of hacks or designs, or as Michael's talking about, like this, you know, the kind of scaffolds to change team dynamics. So I think that we asked about future research. I think given that we are going to be working more and more from a distance, this isn't going away. We're working across time zones. We're working across, you know, like geographic cultures, and implicit hierarchies, both within a company and within the world. Thinking about how do we actually begin to engage as humans? How do we use time effectively? How do we actually create systems of trust in this really, really difficult environment? I think is a really important future direction. And the other question you asked me, Hila, was like, was I trying to project something about speed? I think yes and no. My big high horse is that we should only work as fast as, or compress our tasks as much as it makes sense for the task itself. So I think that there are some tasks that we should not be compressing, and we are, because of this, you know, dynamic of, oh my gosh, I have to be available. And if I don't, you know, it might actually be good to sit on an email overnight and craft your response in the morning, right? But because of the cultural dynamic, I have to do it right now. So what I would say is, if you could think of 4 dynamics of working together, you've got your tasks, like what do we have to accomplish by when? You have your norms and values, like, you know, is it valued to be in touch right away? Is it valued, you know, what makes a good worker in this environment? You got your structure. So like, who's the head of the team? These are the roles that Amy has tweaked with, as well as some ideas about scripts or kind of, you know, explicit decision-making rules that Michael was talking about. So you've got your structures, and then you've got your technological tools. So how are we actually engaging? Is it on Zoom? Is it through text? Is it through virtual meetings? Is it in person? If you put these 4 things together, this sounds so easy, but is the impossible grail of organizing. Are they matched? You know, are they aligned in a way that actually serves both the individual, the team, the client, the task, et cetera? So you've got lots of different, you know, kind of outcomes that are going to matter here as well. But so I don't think that I have a strong idea for faster versus slower. It's more just matching those dynamics. And I don't think that speed, we should be wary of speed and compression versus speed and expansion. So are we doing more in less time, or are we just doing more all the time? And I think we need to tease those apart when we're talking about acceleration and compression of time. Sorry, I went on and on there, but I have a lot to say on that subject.
So this was great. And you moved us already to the next, you know, question, which was around future research. So this is great. And just to clarify also what I think about compression versus acceleration, because even using these terms, we were debating when we were writing our paper, And for me, acceleration is kind of on the high level of this process that used to happen now overall happens faster, but it doesn't mean compression, because we also saw the compression leads to failure. So when people try just to do the same thing faster, it fails. So one of the biggest insight is that we need to redefine, rethink what we're doing. We cannot just do the same thing faster. So you're right also in the question of maybe it's not even the same type of psychological safety that can develop online or faster. I'm not sure. We don't know yet, right? We definitely found that it's not the same type of team coordination. It cannot happen. Those teams that try to coordinate it well also failed under these conditions, because you cannot work well and have all the time and have the cognitive flexibility to be creative and all of this in 72 hours. It just doesn't work, right? So I think it's really interesting to question ourselves in this period when we're trying to equate speed with the old ways of doing, and not to assume that, but instead to pause for a second and to think about how we put these things in advance. So what I like between the three of you talking about the scaffolding and those scripts and those, with Michael, the way you said that you can attune and the feedback questions is to take a step almost before you jump into the work, if fast or not, but if especially in the remote, and you try to think how you design it differently, right? There is something here about not assuming that the way we used to work now, we just move it online and it should be the same, right? It should not be the same. Like Michael was saying, we shouldn't even aspire to try to do the same thing, right? We should think about something better, different. So I think this is something really interesting for future research. So that was my kind of quick spiel, I would say, to get the conversation going on what else should we study, which is not the same but faster, but what is new now when we're doing things faster remotely? What is different? What could be done differently, better? So I'm curious to hear. We have only kind of a couple of minutes for Michael and Amy. If you have, one question to say that you want to say that we need to study more, please share with the audience, and then we'll take some of the questions that they had to you.
Let me just say, I want to say one very quick, but I think important thing about psychological safety and speed, because in fact, a lot of my work would suggest that lack of psychological safety is quite simply a slower downer, right? Because people don't speak up about the things they know, the things they worry about, and then finally it comes to light later, and generally not in such a good way. So my experience is that when you can get a team, and let's remember what psychological safety is really all about. It's about felt permission for candor. When you can get a team to have felt permission for candor, it's a speeder upper. Only in the sense of, we're not doing more and going crazy. We're wasting less time with the, gee, I wonder if I can say this here.
I do it in the second class that I teach because I think we should do it so early on. I immediately do my psychological safety in the beginning to save that time later. So
right. Save time. It's a stitch in time kind of thing. And one just quick thing, and maybe this is studyable, Melissa, I would love to study this, but I'm not old enough, but my father was old enough to work as a manager in an era, the era I grew up in which it was absolutely a given culturally that if someone was sort of at his desk, and it was largely his, after 6, there was some eyebrows raised, like the poor guy, right? He couldn't get his work done. And I think that is a cultural feature we need to bring back, right? We need to start saying, yeah, if you're really working 24/7, gosh, my heart goes out to you, but maybe we can help.
You're not that effective.
Right. Like, because, it's that sort of ability to get things done and then go out for a run, be with your kids, all the other things. Like, that's what a whole and healthy employee around here looks like. And we want to help you be that person.
A quick anecdote. I was in an organization that shifted from one manager that thought that we should work until, ever, never. And like people would like slag and carry the whole day just to stay late. And then a new manager came with what you're saying exactly. And we were shocked because she basically pulled all the time reports and we were sure she's going to be so proud that we all work so hard. And this is a legal environment. So of course it's all about crunching the time. And then she said, something is wrong here. You guys are working like not efficiently. And we were like, what? So she was amazing. She became later the head of the whole organization and everything. So I do believe things could be better.
So there's a research, just since I'm supposed to say, I think there is a research question buried in here. And if you think about culture, not as a given, but as something that is always sculptable, always changeable, then sort of how you do this and how you, what kinds of things, what scripts, Michael, what will be the ones that help us build the kind of healthy cultures for innovative, efficient, engaging work, but not burnout. I think there's research to be done there.
So Michael, your take on future research, and then we'll take a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, so this is going to be a system designer's take on future research. So this is sort of exhorting my own field. Since the 1980s, there's been a ton of really valuable research that has been trying to accelerate or improve sort of productivity and collaboration outcomes. It's been really focused on productivity narrowly. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. It's easier to measure in some cases. We know how we can intervene on it. Make a better Skype, get a better team. And we want to make email easier to sort through and find the right things and suggest replies and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the big missing piece here and the big opportunity is to make the designing for the relational outcomes, including the kinds of constructs like psychological safety, as first class in that literature as the designing directly for the sort of productivity outcomes, which has just dominated the literature so much. So, complement this work on, faster responses or sorting of email with how do we understand how we're doing? How do we make it better? And I like Amy's take, because building relationships online, especially in an era of COVID, is not fast. I mean, Jeff Shang, who's in the sociology department here at Stanford, studied the building of relationships on Twitch, which is an online video streaming platform. And drawing on like Walter's hyperpersonal model, people do it. People like create best friends in these online streaming services, but it looks really different. It takes a while. I just feel like if we're designing for those kinds of outcomes, I think you're going to get the accelerations you're looking for. I think you're just sort of like wringing a dry towel if you're trying to accelerate, the direct collaboration tools as the part of the chain that's really missing.
Thank you, Michael. This is fascinating and does offer multiple research direction, I think. So a question from the audience, which is unique, is how do you think about the role of personality in the context of team dynamic, especially when speed is important? Anyone feel free to take. This is a question from Lower Cast.
I have kind of a cynical response. And not that I don't believe that people don't have core personalities, I do. But I think if you're in a team dynamic in an organization with a very strong cultural norms, that those are going to supersede personality to a large degree, or you're going to self-select out of that work eventually. I mean, I just have to say that one of my first studies as a graduate student was interviewing lawyers and venture capitalists and investment bankers about this brand new technology called the BlackBerry that they were all very excited to have, and they were the only ones in society that really had it at that point. And I remember walking down the street and being very depressed because I was a graduate student and didn't quite understand the whole research project at this point, because I had just talked to 65 people who all told me they were type A personality and that the BlackBerry allowed them to be better at what they are and who they are. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have no difference and no data here. Well, what became interesting was to unpack why 65 people all told me the same thing. And it's a combination of me, I believe at this point, it's a combination of self-selection. So, there is some degree of different kinds of core personality traits are going to gravitate towards different jobs, but also to a large degree, people recognizing the personality traits that are valued here and displaying them, or at least describing themselves in that way. So I wasn't doing like deep personality assessment at all. I was talking to them about their sense of self, like they were just telling me. So it was their kind of first layer of rationalization of who they are and what they value. So I do think that, yes, I think we could maybe think about personality as part of one of the different things to design around when we're thinking about these teams, but we shouldn't ever underestimate the role of culture.
Thank you so much. So on the role of culture, actually, the next question we have, and Laura, by the way, also responded that maybe she didn't mean the word personality in that degree, but it's okay. We all have, this is exactly, I think, the interesting part, this kind of, how does personality sits with the team, and then you have the culture. So on the culture, we have a question from Batya, who asked, what would a culture of efficiency look like in an industry like healthcare that is so oriented toward volume? And that's definitely something that a lot of research is now, of course, going into healthcare since they need a lot of help. So anything that you have to think about it, that would be great.
To me, the best answer is learning. Like it's what you're really looking for. Well-run healthcare organizations is a culture of learning, because historically, yes, there's always been a number of procedures, number of patients seen that's still present. But what we do know about healthcare delivery is that it's at least 30% waste, right? So that's at least 30% of the activities are happening are not adding value, and that's we can unpack what constitutes waste, and it would take another whole seminar. But probably the most important one and the easiest to flag is rework, right? Anytime someone is doing something related to a patient's care that's either already been done before or has to be redone because it wasn't done the right way, et cetera, that's waste. And it is totally preventable with a culture of just profound learning, teaming, vigilance, speaking up early rather than erring on the side of holding back when one isn't sure whether one's voice is welcome.
Can I just add one thing
on that? Sure.
I agree completely with what Amy's saying, but we also have to think in addition to that about these full work process systems that we're using to really heavy-handedly shape in the service of efficiency and effectiveness, shape work process. But the work itself is unpredictable, particularly in healthcare. And I feel like that we're trying too hard to shape work practice in a way that actually creates more waste that's never going to go away, because people have to work around these systems that they're expected to work through. I've also done some work in healthcare, and it was really interesting to see how the technology was undermining exactly what you're talking about.
And the scaffold paper, we took about 30% out of the lead time, right? So that was waste that went away with just an easier a set of light structures that helped build a stronger culture of teaming, if you put it that way.
The technology can play both sides, right? We are seeing in the study with Sarah that AI, which is supposed to be more efficient and help physicians even be faster in their diagnosis, is actually making some of their work longer a little bit because they need to try to understand these opaque tools. So it is something to be explored. So I would say we are in our last couple of minutes. So a sentence from each of you, and thank you so much. And then I think we'll close. So for me, just thank you. And anyone who's curious about acceleration and innovation, I would love to talk later. Email me, and I would love to engage more intellectually. This has been a topic that I really find fascinating in the last couple of years. And thank you everyone for coming.
Let me put a plug in for system design, aka Michael, because a lot of the problem with healthcare AI and just regular healthcare IT has been it's so badly designed that people will report having to click through 14 screens to order an aspirin, right? So we understand their frustration, and part of it means we need more of Michael's time.
I would just take that one step further and say it's everyone's time. The idea that you could bring the social psych, the sociology, ethnography, and the design together is really where we need to go to push forward so that we get the full picture in the future.
I was just trying to make less work for myself, just saying.
I mean, it sounds like a obvious tautology, but when people in my field create startups that are not grounded in the empirical research, they do a ton of harm. And likewise, if all we ever do is navel gaze, we can't make the impact that my colleagues on this panel are having. So there's this being able to again walk around it and say, oh, this gave me the insight, now let's intervene this way. That's the real trick.
Let's try it. Let's test it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Action research.
Definitely. So Juliana and Nate, do you want to close or should we close?
We just wanted to say thank you guys so much. This was fascinating. Nate and I learned a ton. We were actually texting behind the scenes the whole time, like, wow, I didn't know about this paper. This is fantastic. So we really, really enjoyed it. Thank you all. We learned a ton, and we'll see you all again for the next Tech Talk. All right, take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.